say you.
In 2023, many were shocked to learn that the shooter at a shopping mall was a Latino with white supremacist beliefs.
We're learning disturbing details about the racist beliefs of the shooter in Allen, Texas.
He had a swastika tattoo on his chest.
Authorities have identified him as 33-year-old Mauricio Garcia.
Another Latino, the leader of the hate group the Proud Boys, is now in prison for his actions on January 6th. How do we make sense of this racism in the Latino community?
Latinos can be racist. It is a part of our own legacies of slavery and anti-Blackness.
I'm Eddie Robinson. Stay tuned for a conversation with acclaimed author Tanya Hernández about unmasking the hidden bias of Latinos and other marginalized groups. Oh yeah, I feel you. We hear you. I see you. You're listening to ICU. I'm your host, Eddie Robinson.
If you grow up in South Carolina, literally in second and third grade, you learn about slavery. You grow up and you have, I had Black friends growing up. It is a very talked about thing.
That's Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley defending a controversial response to a voter at a town hall. The voter had asked a very simple question. What was the cause of the U.S. Civil War? Haley gave somewhat of a convoluted answer about individual liberty, freedom for people to be anything they want to be without government getting in the way. But after her remarks, that same voter gave an astute response to her answer.
In the year 2023, it's astonishing to me that you answer that question without mentioning the word slavery.
What do you want me to say about slavery?
No, you've answered my question. Thank you.
Next question.
Nikki Haley is not the first person to say something racist, then declare they're not racist by proclaiming to have Black friends. What makes it notable is that Haley is not white. She was born Nimrata Niki Randhawa to a Sikh family from the Punjab region in India. So was this a simple mistake, an oversight, an overt attempt to avoid talking about race? We can't know what's really in her heart, but she wouldn't be the first person from a historically marginalized group to socially distance themselves from terms associated with Blackness. Another example of this, leaked recordings of Latino city council members in Los Angeles. They're discussing redistricting with extremely racist language. Council President Nury Martinez can be heard disparaging a Latino LA district attorney, saying, "F that guy, he's with the Blacks." She then called a white councilman's adopted Black child, quote, a changuito, a translation for a little monkey.
This white guy with this little Black kid who's misbehaved. Este niño has they're not even, they're not doing, the kid is bouncing off the effing walls on the floor, practically tipping it over. There's nothing you can do to control him. Parece changuito.
This anti-Black bias among other racial groups might seem shocking to some. After all, how can you discriminate when you yourself are often the recipient of discrimination? For Tanya Hernández, racism is complex and multifaceted. But at the end of the day, groups like Latinos can indeed be racist and benefit from this racism. I see you. As we welcome the Archibald R. Murray Professor of Law and the Associate Director of Fordham University's Center on Race, Law, and Justice. She's also the author of Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino Anti-Blackness and the Struggle for Equality. Tanya Hernández. Tanya, welcome to ICU.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Okay, so big picture. This is an issue that we see among all racialized groups in this country, but you focus on Latinos, who are actually the largest minority population in the United States. And interestingly enough, the first line of your book is Latinos can be racist. What do you mean by all of this?
Well, I used that first line, Latinos can be racist, because I wanted there to be no mistake about what the theme of the book was going to be about. I wanted to be very clear. First sentence is always very important in a book.
That's true.
And I wanted also there to be clarity, because whenever I use the words Latinos and racism or Latinos and discrimination, the presumption is always that I am there to talk about or reflect on the discrimination that Latinos experience themselves for being Latino in the United States. And that, of course, is a problem and certainly should be addressed. But that's not the topic of my research, at least not for this book. And part of the difficulty, and hence also the title of this idea about racial innocence, is the notion that Latinos perceive themselves often as not being implicated in issues of discrimination. They can only be victims. They cannot be complicit and active agents in discrimination against others. And the racial innocence also is a way in which the perception is pushed out onto the public stage, such that judges and juries and oftentimes even media representatives do not readily perceive the discrimination that Latinos are implicated in. They think whatever the controversy is, that it's about something else. It's not about race. It's about culture. It's not about race. It's about language distinctions or confusion or cultural, clashes. It's always about something else. It's never about anti-Blackness and racism. Hence the idea of racial innocence.
And, I want to read a quote from your book to put it all into perspective, for me at least. At a meeting of Latino educators in Colorado, Afro-Latina Marta Cruz Jansen was met with great hostility and was told, "Some Hispanics don't want you to be one of them because you represent everything they don't want to be. How dare this black woman speak Spanish and claim to be one of us? They want you to stop saying that you're like them." And this mindset really captures the essence and the need for a book like this, Dr. Hernández. And we really applaud the work that you're doing with a book like this. And while the concern should be talking about issues like, lack of funding, school to prison, the pipeline, these folks are concerned that someone who doesn't look like them or have the same skin complexion is speaking for them, when her lived experience likely shares this very same reality of someone who's black, but yet her reaction, her response is intertwined with the very hate that's plagued oppressed individuals for centuries. So, Tanya, how do you interpret, what's really going on here?
Well, the quote that you pulled is from a portion of the book that looks at schools, because I look at, the way in which discrimination manifests itself in lots of different public spheres, the workplace, public accommodations like restaurants and hotels and nightclubs, the criminal justice system, and the like. And that was the portion that had to do with education. And I have to say that, even after 25 plus years of lawyering and researching in issues of discrimination, I found that chapter almost the most heartbreaking, because it was Latino educators, principals, teachers, etc., being unmasked, as I say in the book, for their anti-Black sentiments against young children. Not to say that ugliness is better understood when it's across adults, but it just feels particularly heartbreaking when children are the targets. The other thing I want to point out about that is that the context also was useful about showing how this is not simply a cultural battle, right, between some group known as Latinos, as heterogeneous and racially varied as we are, but Latinos versus African Americans. When these issues are talked about, that's the limited sphere in which they are examined. And my book is about anti-Blackness writ large, meaning it's about the way in which Latino anti-Blackness harms Afro-Latinos, African Americans, West Indians, Africans, Africanists across the diaspora. And so this is more than just about, a battle for resources, a battle for the spoils of whatever exists in our society, right? This is a deeply entrenched form of racial hostility that emanates from Latin America. It's not made in the United States, not made in the USA. It is something that has long entrenched histories of slavery within Latin America and the Caribbean. And that's why when I say anti-Blackness, I like to be very clear, right, that it's much broader, right, than any particular ethnic group.
It's ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we're speaking with Tanya Hernández, Fordham law professor and author of the book Racial Innocence. So Tanya, race is a construct. You can be like 80% European, but if you look black, then you're black in this country. We like to think it's science, but it's really sociology. And that's not to say that it's also, very real when you're talking about lived experiences. What's your view on how race is constructed?
Well, I think the way in which it's easier to understand this idea of that race is a social construct and race is not biology, that academics often say, and they presume the rest of the society is readily on board with their academic language. But here's a way in which I think, to break it down very easily, at least in my view. People tend to think that racism and the stereotypes that are developed are all about skin color, right? That, and if we were all the same skin color, if we all mixed and we all get together and we all look kind of like one middle brownish, lightish shade, that's always the presumption that that's what the mix is going to look like. But anyway, then, dealing with color is going to deal with any kind of bias, right? And what that doesn't readily understand is that when you look at how people experience discrimination, the lightest skinned people can still experience racial discrimination because someone thinks that their hair is too tightly coiled, or they perceive the nose as being too broad, or their lips as being too big, right? Or their behind as, larger than what society deems as appropriate. And in other words, there is a racialization process. This is how race is made. We take an attribute and then we stick all kinds of presumptions about what it means, right? Less intellect, more superiority, whatever stereotype we want to put on it. And it can be on anything. Someone's hair, someone's nose, someone's behind, So that's not about this idea of biology. It's about the ideas that we superimpose on someone's biology. And that has no rhyme or reason. Now, that's not to say that racism is not real. Just because it's made up in this make-believe land of, I see your earlobe is a little longer than someone else's earlobe, and I think that means that makes you a X kind of a race, and X people of the X race are, much better at singing because of that long earlobe. I've just made all this up on the spot, so hopefully everyone can tell. That itself is a way in which, right, we operate in the make-believe, but the consequences are real, right? I long ago remember reading this quote in which the author talks about sort of race as a social construct, as race being this unicorn, right? This like mythical, non-real unicorn, but whose horn still draws blood. That was Anthony Appiah, actually, who said that. And so, if you think of race as a social construct, think about that unicorn wreaking havoc and having people bleed and die on the street. Right? It comes from a make-believe, but it has some real consequences when we act as if it's real.
Let's dive deep into your background. How did being an Afro-Latina, play a role in how you grew up?
Well, what it enabled me, I think, to perceive more readily, perhaps, than people without that background, as I put it that way.
Sure.
The benefits of diversity is that I was exposed to almost like a seeming schizophrenia with regards to race within my family and within my community. And I say schizophrenia because, at one side of, one side of the mouth, right? There would be this elevation of Latinos as superior, right, to non-Latinos. That is, Americanos, Americans, meaning North American Anglo-English speakers, right? That we were better than them because we didn't have racism. We didn't, delve into, juxtaposing people black versus white. We were all mixed, and we were all so proud of our indigenous ancestry, right? So proud, but we won't talk about the other aspects of it. But in any case, that was one side of the mouth, right? And at the very same time, sometimes the same paragraph, the same sentence, right? I would hear family, friends, and neighbors, community members talk about los morenos, the black people, right? And, depending on how irritated somebody was, the anti-blackness could be about African Americans, it could be about Africans, it could be about other Afro-Latinos, right? So this idea about not having any form of racism at the same time that all this anti-black rhetoric would be utilized was something that I was exposed to and was very confused by, right? And my mother would, proud Afro-Latina herself, would simply say, they don't understand. This is not how things are talked about, within Puerto Rico, within Cuba, within Latin America, etc. And so, I kind of accepted it as this odd cultural schizophrenia. What motivated me to do the research and write the book, right, was when, as a lawyer and legal scholar, I started to see these ideas. Latinos aren't racist. We can't be racist. And then harming other people with our racism. When I started to see it surfacing in law cases, right? I would see cases in which a Latino comes into court and says, this other Latino refused to promote me. I happen to be Afro-Latino. They are white-appearing Hispanic or white-identifying Hispanic for all I know, because we got them all, within Latin America and the Caribbean. And it did it based on race. Very, clear cut. I was qualified. They didn't promote me. They promoted some other Latino instead. So you would think this is sort of like, all right, sounds like straight up racism to me, unless you have some justified business reason for it, like defend yourself with. But rather than coming forward with a business defense, which is, acceptable for an employer, instead, the Latino supervisors would come forward with, but I can't be racist. I'm Latino. And where I was infuriated was where I would see that there would be judges and juries that would buy into that kind of position, as if it were a legal defense, which it is not. Right? That's not part of our jurisprudence. And so I wanted to see, was that a one-off? Was that just sort of one weird case, one or two weird cases? And that's what started me on the journey to look at this much more broadly, and hence, look at it within not only the workplace, but education and public accommodations, spaces of public leisure, and the criminal justice system.
If you're enjoying the show, subscribe to our podcast. Look for ISEEU, that's the letter U, with Eddie Robinson on your favorite platform. And now you can also find us on YouTube. Coming up, we continue our conversation with Fordham law professor Tanya Hernández, author of Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino Anti-Black Bias and the Struggle for Equality. How does this anti-black bias play out within Latino families? Plus, can you be Latino and black in America today? It's a question many Latinos, like rapper Cardi B, find themselves constantly having to respond to. I'm Eddie Robinson. I See You returns in just a moment. We'll be right back. You're listening to ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson. You know, when most folks talk about race, they want to put everyone into neat categories or buckets, like this person is black, this person is Asian, this person is white. But in reality, it's a bit more complex than that. We've been speaking about race and racism with Tanya Hernández, a professor at Fordham University School of Law, and the author of the book Racial Innocence. She focuses on the intersection of race and the law. So Tanya, our audience is listening to this episode, but we're looking at each other virtually on our computers, and I can plainly see that you're visually someone of African descent. Your family is from Puerto Rico, but I want to ask you, do you consider yourself to be a black woman?
I do.
Huh. Are you Latino? Is it different how you're categorized in the U.S. mainland versus Puerto Rico?
Well, the thing is that I think that's often overstated is this idea that Latinos who are visually, unambiguously of African ancestry, right? Or as my children like to say, blackity blacks, right? Unmistakably black. That we who are Latino, who look like that, don't want to say that we are black, right? I think that is often overstated. And the reason why I say it's overstated is because sometimes there's this misperception if someone says, I'm not African American, I'm Afro-Latino, that they're trying to say they're not black with that. As opposed to perceiving it as that's an individual who's trying to actually be culturally sensitive and appropriate, right? Is it different to say that you have a cultural background and upbringing rooted in African American culture, which of course varies geographically, right? You know, to say what's African American in Mobile, Alabama is different than saying what's African American in Oakland, California, right? So nonetheless, when you're talking oversimplistically, one could say that there's an African American, right, culture. An Afro-Latino who was raised in Puerto Rico, for instance, whose first language was Spanish, right? I'll give you a quick example. I got married in New York, and I had a caterer that was very good at following my instructions, which were to serve Afro-Cuban foods and also African-American foods because we were a mixed family, right? And so I had some dear friends come from Puerto Rico, and they were very confused when they saw cornbread next to the arroz con habichuela y fricassé, right? And the reason why they were confused was because in Puerto Rico, cornbread is a dessert. It is not part of a meal. You don't put it with dessert. You eat it. You love it. It's delicious. But the thought is that is not dinner food. That is dessert food. So that's a way of me trying to sort of articulate, right? You can believe you're black, but you can have different cultural attributes of how you perceive what is blackness, what is black music to you, right? It's different in Senegal than it's going to be, right? In the Deep South, right? There are different versions of all this. I say all that to say this. So when an Afro-Latino says, I'm Afro-Latino, I'm not African-American, that's not, I'm not recognizing my blackness. That's recognizing that I'm black and also that my cultural attachment to blackness is somewhat distinct. Now, all of us who live within the United States and become Americanizado, Americanized, do we also come to love and be part of what is African American blackness and culture? Of course, right? That's part of the beautiful sort of interaction that happens that creates salsa, right? In the 1960s. And so the idea that there's a deep entrenched desire not to recognize blackness, I reject somewhat some of that premise. Now, are there folks who are light skinned who, when you say, oh, I notice you tan very easily in the summertime, and that your hair is very curly.
Yes.
Are there people who would say, oh, yes, that's because of my Taino ancestors, or,
there you go.
Of course, right? But we also have that with non-Latinos, right? A refusal or even an ignorance about understanding what aspects of their own culture, their own language, right, is really African descendant. We see that across the United States, let alone the globe. But this idea that Latinos are unique in wanting to reject blackness, I think, in my view at least, that is somewhat overstated. Now, does it exist? Yes, it does. Right? Are there people who, no matter what, they part of their upbringing within the structural rules in our Latino societies of anti-Blackness means that
Great description.
it's always about rejecting that. Yes, people struggle. It's hard to be growing up and love yourself when you are raised within societal structures and communities that reject Blackness as the embodiment of good, except in its appropriate places. Appropriate places meaning if you're shaking your behind, you're singing, you're entertaining, you're serving, then your Blackness is viewed as appropriate, right, and acceptable, but not as part of, what is an intellectual source of importance for a society.
I'm Eddie Robinson, and you're listening to ICU, and we're speaking with law professor Dr. Tanya Hernández, author of Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino Anti-Blackness and the Struggle for Equality. I'm still curious in terms of, it just seems like there's this obsession in Latino families over skin color. Before I get to the question, I want to play this audio clip. It's from actor Eva Longoria on a podcast that she was recently on, talking about her family racializing each other in pretty shocking ways.
All my three sisters were blonde.
Yeah.
And I was the only one that came out with black hair, dark skin, dark eyes. My sisters have these beautiful hazel eyes. My mom's güera, which is the white one. They call her Tia Güera because she's so light-skinned.
Yeah.
And so I grew up as La Prieta Fea, which means the ugly dark one.
No way.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Who called you that?
My mom.
No.
My family.
As like a joke?
No, as like it's in term of endearment.
Why this obsession, Dr. Hernández, with skin color within a family? You might expect someone who doesn't know you to call you ugly, but not your mother, your own mother. Have you experienced instances where preferential treatment was given to a specific family member based on skin color?
Well, there is a hypervigilance with regards to skin shade, right? And so that's why I always mystify when people say, Latinos are not racist. They're all racially mixed and they have all different kinds of shades in their family. But, that's factual, right? That we have all different shades in our family. It's also factual that many other communities have all kinds of shades in their family as well, right? But this theory that we sort of impose on that by saying, all those shades mean there's no racism here, totally overlooks the experiences of an Eva Longoria and many others in the Latino community who have been subject to family members wanting to police their appearance, right? Meaning there's a hypervigilance about it. It's noticeable. So all those phrases about staying out of the sun, not wearing light colors, you don't want to emphasize just how dark you are if you happen to be darker hued. So you should not be wearing white, wearing light nail polish and what have you. And the reason why those kinds of phrases immediately come to mind is because, unfortunately, my poor mother, who was the darkest in her family, also got policed in that way and was traumatized actually by it. The more and more I did, the research, the more I saw that this was unfortunately part of our own legacies of slavery and anti-Blackness, right? People say, slavery was so long ago. Why do you keep bringing that up, right? And the thing is that the logics for justifying slavery don't go away when slavery ends, right? A whole intellectual apparatus was set up to what we call stereotypes, right? To justify why Black people could be subject to slavery, and we wouldn't have a moral problem with it, right? Across the globe. And those logics don't go away simply because you have formally, right, eradicated or abolished slavery without abolishing the racial hierarchies that you thought were appropriate at the time.
Historically speaking, we think about the images that we've associated with certain people. And many cultures, for instance, some Dominicans, from what I've gathered out of a documentary that I was watching, with friend to the show, Henry Louis Gates Jr., in his visit to Santo Domingo, there were many Dominicans who simply did not want to identify themselves with being Black. And if you look at their skin, the complexion was similar to that of Gates, if not darker. And as they were walking down the street, they came across a shop that featured these vintage figurines, these minstrel black-faced dolls that emphasized these stereotypical depictions of blacks from back in the day. And it recalled, the buffoonery of those times.
Look at this. For Dominicans, this represents African heritage, sambos. This is nothing but sambos. So that explains why people, the way they portray Africans, why a kid would not say, I am African, because that's what they give you, that's what they show you.
How much do you think that, Dr. Hernández, plays into folks' mental state? That blacks are not seen as humans, that, our humanity has to be disrupted somehow, and we're constantly reminded of these images that are associated with the buffoonery of back in the day.
Most certainly, all the cultural symbols that we are surrounded by, that we're sort of like taking in messages of, but without actually readily appreciating that all the stuff that we're taking in, that certainly influences us. Which is sort of kind of tie this together with your earlier question, Eddie. Sort of when Eva says, that la prieta fea, that was a term of endearment. I want to kind of address that too, because you might have Latinos in the audience and they'll be, that's right, Hernández. You see, we say it with love. So that's not racism. All right. And here's the thing. Lots of things can be said so-called with love, but that doesn't mean that it takes away the racialized aspects of what are being said. Like, meaning you don't say, oh, how precious this little white girl. I mean, we got plenty of ways of saying that. We say you're pretty, and that in itself is sort of attributing to the person's whiteness. But going back to the phrases, right? The thing about the phrases is that oftentimes what they are ways to tame blackness, to put blackness in a more palatable container. And here's what I mean by that, right? When a family member or friend or what have you is like, they call you my little black person, right? Mi negrita. Mi negrito, right? My. It's all about saying, you're not like the other ones. You are my little black person, right? I notice your blackness because that matters, right? I see it and I don't unsee it. I see it, but it's not as bad as them other black people because you're in my realm of intimate care. Now, mind you, social science studies have documented the ways in which within a single family, siblings, twins who happen to come out different shades get different familial investments. Some people get their education paid for, some people get all the love, some people get all the presumptions of intellect, and that is arrayed across a line of pigment, right? Same family, same resources, right? But they have their own form of Jim Crow segregation within the family. So having these phrases, they exist, right? But it doesn't mean that even if the person who's saying them is someone who purportedly loves you and is sincere about saying they love you, it doesn't mean that there's not a racialized aspect. And also, let's go back to slavery for a minute, a very patriarchal way in which the phrases are utilized. It's sort of almost like, the idea of the patriarchy and the paternalism of slavery's past. My slaves are okay. Your slaves are a problem. My slaves, that's different. They're mine, right? So this is how you try to make some form of sense out of something that is inherently illogical, but there's a pattern here, right? And the pattern is that, blackness is always problematic.
Coming up, we wrap up our chat with Fordham University law professor Tanya Hernández, author of Racial Innocence. Several high-profile black women in academia have lost their jobs. As a black academic teaching about race, does Tanya feel pressure to avoid controversy? Is she walking on eggshells when talking about diversity and DEI? Or is she nervous of even losing her job? I'm Eddie Robinson. I see you. All that and more on our final segment right after this. If you're enjoying this program, be sure to subscribe to our podcast, I See You with Eddie Robinson. You can hear all the past episodes and be notified when new episodes are released. Also, please take a minute to give us a review or comment. We love getting feedback from our listeners. This is ICU. I'm your host, Eddie Robinson. We're speaking with Fordham University law professor Tanya Hernández, author of the book Racial Innocence. So, is the face of white supremacy changing? Well, recent events, like a shooting at a mall in Allen, Texas,
Mauricio Garcia was a neo-Nazi.
Or the riot on January 6th at the Capitol.
Miami native Enrique Tarrio convicted with 3 other Proud Boys members of seditious conspiracy.
Were perpetrated by Latinos, men who you wouldn't call white per se, but who've clearly internalized ideas of white supremacy. Tanya, this really reminds me of a recent episode of ICU a few months ago, where we hosted a panel of Muslim community members from the PBS documentary A Town Called Victoria. We discussed the burning of their mosque by a white supremacist who happens to be Latino, a Mexican-American that embraced this ideology online and to his friends. What do you make of all of this as it relates to these white supremacist views, and then we unmask them and then they're Latino? What's going on there?
Well, part of what is confusing for so many is first that they think that Latinos are people of color where there are no color distinctions. And the truth of the matter is, right, Latinos come from Latin America and the Caribbean, in which we have, just like in the United States, some of us who are black, some of us who are white, some of us who are indigenous, some of us are Asian, right? We got all the racial diversity of the United States in Latin America and the Caribbean, right? And so some of us actually are white. Now, that doesn't mean every white person is a white supremacist, but that is to say that the ideas of whiteness and white supremacy are not foreign to us. They are part of our culture. Now, put that into a U.S. context. Imagine this, right? A white Latino or someone who very, very, very much wants to be perceived as a white Latino. And they're in the United States, in which they learned very quickly, right? No. No matter how light you are, if we see that last name and it's got a Z at the end, right? If there's a Hispanic surname or you speak Spanish, you have an accent, we don't care. Right. If you look like you're from Sweden, once we know that information, you still, right, are not perceived as superior, right, and as having as much inherent value to our society, right, as those who don't have the Latino heritage. So, imagine yourself within that context, right, and wanting to exercise a sense of self-esteem racially, right? The quick track to that, right, is to be a complicit and an active agent in white supremacy. Now, oftentimes people say, well, why would these groups even accept them? Well, for some of these folks, they're not even in a group. They're wannabes, right? Mauricio Garcia, the Allen, Texas, shooter at the Dallas Mall, right? He was not in a group, but he had the tattoos, he had the swastika on himself and what have you. He wanted desperately to be part of a group, but he was a lone shooter, right? Then there are those who actually are part of a group, like an Enrique Tarrio, the Proud Boys leader, right? Correct. And that, it seems to me, is another sort of the devilment, right, of white supremacy. These white supremacist leaders within the United States have been quick to see the ways in which they want to make themselves be viewed even more acceptable as more like it's a political view. It's not racism. It's a political view. What way to make it look political? To have those who are sort of white Caucasian in the Anglo sense also be part of pushing out the message of white supremacy. But even the Proud Boys and all these other groups have been very clear: no African American or people with African American ancestry, right? There's a line, right, in which that is drawn and there has to be police. So, yes, there are Latinos who want to be and are accepted within white supremacist organizations, and it's a way in which some might say they navigate their own resistance to being viewed as non-white others who are inferior. You get to feel more than by saying you have the cloak of white supremacy that you are out there enforcing.
As a professor, Dr. Hernández, of critical race theory, how do you feel about this growing desire in the last few years to remove this curriculum from schools? I mean, here in Texas, say the University of Houston, where we're based, this diversity, equity, and inclusion concept, right? These DEI positions and policies have been removed per state law. Do critics of CRT have a point? Does it promote intolerance and divides people? Why should children, white children, who didn't themselves own slaves, feel responsible for those that did?
Well, I mean, that's part of the propaganda about critical race theory, that what it teaches is to, have white children feel bad about themselves and to feel responsible and what have you. It conflates too much, right? But the benefit of critical race theory, one, it's not taught in K through 12. That's also another part of the misrepresentation. But I actually think it should be taught in K through 12.
It should be taught.
I think it should be.
Oh,
and here's why. Critical race theory is a way to help children and adults, for that matter, understand the disparities that exist when there isn't a Ku Klux Klan member with a noose in their hand trying to enforce segregation. Right? Meaning, how do we understand the difficulties that our society seems to be still struggling with regards to education and the racial disparity in scores, right? If we think it's all about individuals and their individual cultural, respect for education, right? If we take away all the education, which critical race theory believes doing, giving things a historical and social understanding by giving context, you do not see there has long been a disinvestment in the public education of children of color. Then you can't understand why there's a struggle with scores. Right? If you don't provide the same kind of investments, if you do not provide the same kinds of resources, well, then of course you're setting up children for failure. But if we take away those histories of segregation, of disinvestment, all you're left with is, well, I guess this must be because they don't, one, work hard enough, or two, there must be something to this biology business. We are taking and robbing them of a full education and being able to use their own intellect and creativity to make the world a better place. But instead of sort of literally whitewashing our history, these children are deprived of a very key analytical tool for, one, understanding where we have been and being part of the solution to where we can go forward.
This is ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson. We've been chatting with Tanya Hernández. She's the author of Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino Anti-Black Bias, and The Struggle for Equality. With Black women in these prominent university roles, it seems like, there's this messaging coming across with the media and the journalism of what's happening with these women is that they're pushing a diversity agenda. 3 prominent Black women come to mind here. There's this fiasco of denying tenure to Nikole Hannah-Jones at the University of North Carolina.
Award-winning journalist Nikole Hannah-Jones was denied tenure days after being offered a position as night chair at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill.
There's Kathleen McElroy's bungled hiring at Texas A&M to lead their journalism school.
Texas A&M has reached a $1 million settlement with a Black journalism professor after the university changed its mind about hiring her.
And most recently, Claudine Gay.
But Harvard president Claudine Gay has announced she is resigning from office.
The accusations of pushing radical race agendas was put forth as reasons to not hire or to fire these women. As a BIPOC woman in a leadership role yourself at a prominent university, do you feel as if you're walking on eggshells periodically, constantly monitoring what you should say, what you shouldn't say, as to avoid this notion of controversy that might somehow lead to you having to write a letter of resignation or administration pushing you out? Do you fear for your job?
Well, one thing that I learned very early on, and here's because I had the benefit of mentors, right? Older African-American, Latina mentors who were very clear to me about sort of like what kind of a profession, both as a lawyer and as a legal scholar, I was entering into. And with the benefit of my mentors, I have long understood that I do not have the same luxury as some of my peers, right? That is to say, as long as, I'm at the top of my game, the books are being published, everything is, excellence.
Excellence. Quadruple squared.
Then I'm fine, right? The moment that there is a misstep or a perception, right, that there is a misstep, I have seen, with, colleagues in other schools and what have you, I'm not afforded the same luxury of either being able to explain myself or to defend myself. And so, I would be lying if I didn't say that that's not part of a little caution sign that I have in my mind.
You talk about the social distance gap between Latinos and Blacks. Is it possible to close this gap, Dr. Hernández, and have these two communities come together for their mutual benefit? How do we get rid of this anti-Black sentiment?
Well, first I would say that the anti-Black sentiment is not just about African Americans, right? That the anti-Black sentiment comes from our histories of having been the region where 90% of the transatlantic slave trade was brought, right? So you talk about what is the history of slavery. It is a Latin American Spanish-speaking history, whereas only 3.5% were forcibly brought to what we now call the United States. So think about those numbers. But, as it affects and is manifested within these communities who often live side by side, right? African Americans and Latinos, and Afro-Latinos included therein. We have always had, instances of communal relation, fellowship, intermarriage. It's not that this doesn't already exist, that there are community groups that have long been doing this work in Los Angeles, in Boston, in New York, and elsewhere. But what we can't no longer do is presume that simply because we are Latino, that means we don't have work to do. And I think that the move forward is to recognize that just like any other group, we have histories and stereotypes, etc., that need to be addressed, as opposed to believing that we get a pass, right? That, our racism is not real racism. If it's hurting somebody else, if it's killing a Trayvon Martin, well, then it is racism. And it shouldn't be excused as less important, right, than the Klan members who only speak English.
Another moving forward question, what can Latino and other non-Black people of color do to check themselves before they wreck themselves on their own racism? Do you think privilege is hard for people of color to recognize in themselves?
Well, I think that for Latinos in particular, part of the difficulty often stems from this idea, but I am the victim of discrimination too. Or I don't have documentation. I live in fear of my life every day. I have it worse, right? And I think the important thing here is that it's just not about an oppression Olympics, right? This is not about who has it worse. This is about recognizing where the harm is being done. And that can be multiple sites of harm. And it doesn't mean that they all don't need to be addressed. I care about, children in cages at the border just as much as I care about anti-Blackness. One doesn't have to come at the cost of the other. And I think that part of the problem that we often have within communities of color is this defense mechanism of, if I acknowledge, that anti-Blackness is a problem, then I'm denying that, my own struggles or those of my ancestors, don't have importance to be recognized. And I think that that's viewing this always as a zero-sum game, that recognizing and valorizing the importance of recognition means that it can only be done at the sacrifice of someone else's recognition. I think, we need to kind of broaden our horizons, just like a parent has unlimited love for all the children, right? You can also, there's not a limit on wanting to be in fellowship and recognizing the importance of not harming one another, whatever systems and structures that may come from.
What lessons, Dr. Hernández, have you learned about yourself thus far as you've been doing this work, and especially as the politics of race become ever more contentious? What lessons have you learned about yourself thus far?
Well, I guess it is a lesson about myself that I had not anticipated. When I wrote the book, right, I got myself braced for an onslaught of you're wrong. She's racist. And that came. So, it was appropriate to brace myself for that. What I was not ready for, what I had not, for whatever reason, anticipated was the emotional response that the book would bring out for people. I get folks from all corners who reach out and write me, or I see them they come to like bookstore events with a book they already read a long time ago, dog-eared with marks, and it's well loved. There's coffee stains on it and everything. In tears, right? And I had not realized that I would be viewed as this locus of representation about the realities of anti-Blackness. And I think that part of that is because, I have viewed myself as for so long as like lawyer, warrior, activist, scholar, but not necessarily as a spokesperson being able to lift up these voices for folks who have been feeling harmed for so long, or who have been in fellowship with those who've been harmed. Or, it's not just Afro-Latinos who come forward to me. It's Latinos of all hues, right? But they love and care about these issues and the people in their lives. And so I have to say that was a real sort of learning process for me, because when it happened at a couple of events, I was like, oh, okay, well, this is interesting. Right? And the book has been out for some time now. So I have to say that has been something, a new view sort of what my role is in the world has come to me in this journey.
I'm just grateful that we have these kinds of conversations, Dr. Hernández, and they're rational. And we have a book that does a great job of speaking out against those efforts that might turn us all against each other. So for that, we thank you. Her name is Tanya Hernández, the Archibald R. Murray Professor of Law and the Associate Director of Fordham University Center on Race, Law, and Justice, and the author of Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino Anti-Blackness and the Struggle for Equality. Dr. Hernández, thank you so much for being a guest on ICU.
Gracias, Eddie. Thank you for having me.
Our incredible team includes Technical Director Todd Holzlander, producers Laura Walker and Mincho Jacob. Special thanks to Ray Nunez and Fordham University School of Law. ICU is a production of Houston Public Media. Visit ICUshow.org for more information about each episode and to find links to our social media channels. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. Look for ISEEU, it's the letter U, with Eddie Robinson. You can also now find us on YouTube. I'm your host and executive producer, Eddie Robinson. And I feel you. We hear you. I see you. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time.